Her arched body separated the sky from the surrounding primeval waters.
Like most ancient peoples, the Babylonians believed that studying planetary movements could help them predict the future.
Today we're going to introduce you to the study of the universe, cosmology.
We come prepackaged with knowledge or observations of this world that give us context as to where we are. Whereas ancient man, there was absolutely no means to comprehend what this world looked like outside of what we're seeing immediately. Where are we is a fundamental question that has most often been answered by religious doctrine. After all, the most fundamental questions of the human condition are, where are we and what should we do? And in which case, if religion is going to step up to that podium to offer that answer of what we should do, it should also answer where we are. But when it comes to the biblical cosmology, this isn't something that appears unique in the historical record. This is something that is very much obviously related to other concepts that were surrounding it and predating it. The overall controversial subjects of the flat earth and the firmament were the status quo for a good long while. But there's a lot more to be interested in here than just simply flat earth conceptions. There's also the matter of the pillars of the earth, the cosmic ocean, and the very substantial fear of the ancients that the sky would fall. So in order to understand and comprehend the biblical cosmology, we have to go through the history of Western cosmology and mythology. And from doing so, we'll understand why the biblical tradition tells us that this is where we are. From our earliest of days, we sought to find this answer. Where are we and what's going on? The litany of architectural finds and ancient monuments that are aligned with the heavens in some sophisticated way. This is an extension of this fascination to honor that order of the above. These variant cultures, whom we believe were not in contact with each other, all carried and honored this fascination. They would give significant labor and significant resources into honoring this very subject. The cleverness of the design, the gods that are turning the wheels of the above, so forth. In these various cultures, again, whom we believe were not in contact with each other, there are a great number of uniformities found between all of them. However, given our subject, when it comes to the Western world, there is a uniform belief that we are surrounded by a cosmic ocean. And this cosmic ocean predates the world and is fundamental to creation stories all around the Western world. In Mesopotamia, in India, in Egypt, so forth. This is universally agreeable. That this beginning state was water. And still yet, that which surrounds us on all sides infinitely is a cosmic ocean. So then, it's no surprise that the earliest of pre-Socratic philosophers who were seeking the answer to what began all of this, answered that it's all water. The prima materia is water, that which was before everything. This was the beginning of philosophy. And it's no accident, because this is the beginning as it's been uniformly believed in the Western world. One might imagine that the originators of this creation story were inspired by the ocean, perhaps, or were inspired by the observation of amniotic fluid as it is a part of our birthing process, and thus the creation story reflects that. In the beginning were the waters, you see. Another notable trope inherited from animism and shamanism is the sacredness of the number 3. And this correlates with the 3 realms as they are found uniformly throughout animistic traditions. The 3 realms are what's here, what's below, and what's above. Mind you, these are certainly not a nod to heaven and hell. This is way before any of that becomes even conceivable, but simply the different realms as they are immediately perceptible to us. The things of which come from below, the things of which come from above, thus 3. You might notice so far that none of this is particularly abstract. It's easy to see how one would divide the experience of this world into 3. And it's easy to see why one would come to make a story about water being the origin of all things, especially since water is necessitated on a daily basis to maintain living. But to go further with this and to start pushing forward into our narrative, we have to look to the Babylonians. And of course, in their creation story as inherited through the Sumerians, it all began with the Abzu, and the Abzu is ever continuous throughout the stories. Even though he is slain, he's also there. It's a bit paradoxical, to be fair. But we start to pick up on another trope, which is the sacredness of the number 7. And this comes from the observation of what can be observed by the eyes in relation to the, quote, planets in the heavens. Mind you, we're in a time that the sun and the moon are also planets. And so by the eye, there are 7 planets and thus 7 heavens, the respective planets being a sort of divide between each subsequent heaven. When it comes to the earth, if you look outward, even if you reach the ocean, it looks like it goes eternally onward, and thus it's flat. And so it's conceived that the world is flat and that there are several heavens that arc around in a dome, and each successive layer is caught up with each successive god or planet, thus the 7 layers above. And if we're particularly attentive to the duality of the world, to be alive, to be dead, to be light, to be dark, then we would also reflect the 7 heavens above with the 7 layers below. This varies throughout time. It depends. Sometimes there are simply 3 heavens and 3 underworlds. But nonetheless, no matter what, this number 7 gets codified and is a regular usage in Babylonian magical incantations. It's no accident that this is the case, because the heavens are that of the gods, the divine, the plans, the fates that come from above. Rain comes from the sky. Rain makes life on earth. The things that come from the sky are of a different order, and that of which we can't tread upon. By our observation, we see that there are 7 layers of this heaven, and thus this is a sacred number. So right away, we have this interchangeable sacredness when it comes to the number 3 and when it comes to the number 7. But there's an issue here. In the beginning, I mentioned that we believe we're surrounded by the cosmic ocean. But we're breathing air and we're not drowning right now. So how is it that we are divided from that cosmic ocean and thus the firmament? This varies throughout time, but the Babylonians believed that there was a hard dome made of jasper that separated the cosmic ocean from our world. And so then we are encased. This is a enclosure that was often said to be as though it was sealed in by a lid. This outer layer needed to be something sturdy, hard, stable, or firm, thus firmament. to keep those waters from rushing in. Although, depending on what tradition we're talking about, there were beliefs that there were gates in this upper layer that could be opened and release waters in, and thus the Great Flood, perhaps. This changes quite a bit as well when it comes to interpretation, but in regards to the stars, this is why it was made of a sort of precious stone. How do they glimmer in that sort of way? And what we know from digging in the ground is that there are these very shiny and captivating gems that seem to resemble those sprites that we see up in the sky. So maybe then the stars are made of a sort of quartz or mica or something to this effect. For the Sumerians, this upper firmament was made of tin. For the early Greek philosophers, they threw out the idea that this was a crystalline structure. Homer referred to it as a bronze and iron sky vault. A fair number of cultures, especially in Europe, lived in a sort of chronic fear that this upper layer would give out and that the sky would fall. So then you can imagine the level of fervor that one would put forward, or a nation would put forward, in placating the gods, making sacrifices to the gods to ensure that they do anything in their power to maintain this vault. So, by the time the Torah comes around and Genesis is introduced, we get lines like this. Genesis 1:17. The stars are set in the firmament, again as though it is a crystalline structure. Or in Genesis 1:6-8. And God said, "Let there be a vault between the waters that separate water from water, the ocean above in space and the ocean below," which is plainly the ocean. God called the vault sky, and there was evening and there was morning the second day. So you see, Genesis is not making itself distinct in this way. It's very much following in the same cosmology as all of its surrounding mythologies. Not to mention, in observation of variant peoples across the world and their creation stories, there is always some lip service given to how the sky became the sky and the earth became the earth. Some sort of effort to separate the two, a great feat pulled off by a very notable god or hero. In addition, when it says that God's face shone on the waters of the deep in Genesis, this is also, as we can tell very plainly, not at all unique. That perhaps these waters started to congeal and started to become more of a land mass. Or maybe there's a secret narrative here that is more resemblant of the earth diver myths, which were very common across Eurasia. It is said, classically speaking, that the first speculations of the earth being round was put forward by the Greeks around the 4th century BC. However, dating is challenging here, but a spherical earth can be found in Zoroastrianism. The ancient Tibetans had the concept of a spherical earth and also believed that the earth had a diameter of 7,000 miles. And of course, the Dogon believed that the earth was spherical and rotates on an axis. Each of these tended to be informed by their own respective creation stories. So, in regards to the subject of a spherical earth, this history is much more complicated than the mainstream narrative tends to put forward. But we're not done here, not at all. There's still the matter of the pillars of the earth and the pillars of heaven. There are a number of different nods to the foundations of the earth throughout the Bible. In Job, we see the pillars of heaven tremble. In Samuel as well, the foundations of the heavens tremble. And then in Job, who shakes the earth out of its place and its pillars tremble? So this reoccurring nod to these pillars. Mind you, there is no portrait that is accurately discerned from these references. It's very hard to imagine what exactly the earth looks like via these biblical references. But when it comes to the mythological foundations for the pillars, the Egyptians are actually much more readily an inspiration for this one. The Egyptians believed that the sky was held up by pillars. And this is a reference to the holy mountains as well. How many times that the holy mountains were believed to hold up the sky. Thus, the mountains were holy because they were your closest way of accessing the heavens. Thus, also why so many sacred things happen, biblically or otherwise, atop the mountain. There's also the confusing case of Atlas. Now, typically, or more contemporaneously, Atlas is depicted as holding up the sky as a dome, or the earth as a dome. However, Atlas's initial inspiration is believed to come from Western Africa and not from Greece proper, and in which case the etymology of his name is mountain, to bear the mountain, or to support the heavens. There are scant, much more ancient depictions of him holding up the pillars and not the sphere of the world. So Atlas, in this way, is an ancient mountain god ascribed to a very specific mountain that holds up the sky via the pillar, which is the mountain. So, yet again, let's take notice that the sky is being actively held up so that it won't fall on top of us by the efforts of the deity. That is retained throughout. So it's very intuitive in this way that if the sky is held up by these pillars, then the earth too is held up by pillars, most notably out of that cosmic ocean. And so then we have these pillars that are out of the cosmic ocean, which holds up the flat world, which is then encircled or sealed in by a firmament, that which keeps out the upper part of the cosmic ocean. But we're not done yet. There's more, because the world, or the universe, depending, is comprised of a dead serpent. And this is the Chaos Conf trope. This deserves a session of its own right, so we'll only touch on this briefly. The world being fashioned by the body of a god is something that dates back beyond any academic recognition. The Rig Veda gives us a great instance of this dismemberment myth trope. Quote, Purusha, from his navel came the mid-air. The sky was fashioned from his head, earth from his feet, and thus they formed the worlds. In Celtic mythology, the god's skull is the dome of heaven. In the Enuma Elish, which is the Babylonian/Sumerian creation story, the sky is made from the body of Tiamat, the goddess of the watery chaos. The splitting of her into two is what splits the earth from the sky. This carries well throughout and isn't always a snake, but in Western mythology or in Proto-Indo-European related mythology, it's always a snake of some kind, and thus Apophis in Egypt, and thus Leviathan in the Torah. The name of the serpent in the Enuma Elish is Tiamat. Etymologically, this word deviates down into Hebrew, and that's Tehom, which means the deep. This serpent in the chaotic waters that encircles the earth. Thus also its relation to the world serpent in Norse mythology. The slaying of this serpent to ensure that the world can thus become is a uniform theme throughout Western mythologies, and thus why they call it the chaos conf trope in comparative religion. Whoever is going to be the predominant figure or the most heroic figure in the given mythology will be the one to slay this chaotic serpent. For the Babylonians, this was Marduk. For the Canaanites, this would be Baal. And for the Abrahamic tradition, this is God. Albeit in the Old Testament, the body of Leviathan seems to be more wasted than it is in other mythologies. In other related mythologies, it's made very clear that the earth is comprised of this body. So you might say in a subtle sort of way, the form of Ouroboros, or the world serpent being circular, is quite the interesting nod to perhaps an understanding, anciently speaking or mythically speaking, that the earth was also round, if the world was comprised of the body of this serpent. Things are starting to get more and more confusing, and that's what I want to indulge. The further confusions when it comes to this cosmology. Because recurringly, throughout the Bible as well, God is said to have these different storehouses. For instance, in Psalms, God brings forth the wind from his storehouses. Both canonically and non-canonically, we find references to God's various storm houses, where he stores time or famine or disease or, again, winds or his own personal upper chambers. So then, if we are going to take account of everything informing the biblical cosmology, then there also must be these places where God keeps these things in particular. And this is quite the nod to ancient mythological traditions, of course. Why wouldn't the god of wind have his own dojo? Why couldn't a god store wind, for instance, in a bag and then hand it to a great hero to use? All of this, though, these different storehouses, these pillars, the firmament, it isn't a cohesive picture. And so especially well after this, Christian scholars will speculate substantially as to what the exact nature of all of this is. The Empyrean is another example of this. The Empyrean heaven. And this word Empyrean is emperos, which is the pyre, which is fire. So believed to be somewhere outside of that cosmic ocean, beyond the cusp of that, is a, quote, ocean of fire. And so then we have these other ways of interpreting the physical world that we are surrounded by, that the lights of the heavens, the stars in quotes, are exposures of this outer Empyrean, that outside of all this is a realm of light or fire. And thus, when God appears, or the angels appear, they are on fire, because that is where they dwell. This fire is evocative of the sacred fire of Zoroastrianism, is also often understood as the light of enlightenment and the fire of purification. So all of this is, in a literal sense, projected to be existing outside of that cosmic ocean. But it should be pointed out, again, this is a much later development of Christian cosmology and isn't necessarily biblical. So let's start circling back to some of the many things that we've brought up already. For instance, here's a question. How many heavens are there? And this is not as straightforward as it might seem. If we look to the Hindu tradition, then there are the lokas, which are these different regions of heaven. Quote, 7 above and 7 below. And then, of course, sometimes there are just simply 3 lokas, or 3 worlds: heaven, earth, and the netherworld. However, when we entertain this greater number of realms or heavens, the one at the very top, the Brahmaloka, is going to be that realm of which there is no death, that realm of which the spirits are amidst the Creator. It should be noted that these are better understood as realms of being as opposed to physical locations. Whereas when they move through that Babylonian tradition and Mesopotamian tradition into the Abrahamic tradition, this gets a little bit more confusing as to their potential materiality. The Bible, as we extend the conversation out to the New Testament now, doesn't name exactly how many heavens there are, but it does have scant references to say that there are more than one. For instance, in Corinthians, it has this quote, "I know a person in Christ who 14 years ago was caught up to the 3rd heaven." And so in this case, we can assume that perhaps maybe there's 3, or that this is just a number among 7 potential heavens, but again, not named. When it comes to Islam, this is much more clear. Recurringly, it names 7 heavens. This is all just to say that this is a bit of a disparate subject, because it's only a question of which tradition we're looking at, whether it's acknowledging this number and how it understands the very concept of what a heaven is in the first place. Are we to assume, as the initial inspiration was, that these heavens are simply the realms of which the planets operate in? Or are we now expanding that scope outward to say that heavens are purely beyond physical, material existence? Modern interpreters, knowing now of scientific cosmology, tend to say that the world, the physical manifestation, including all the galaxies and all of the observed universe, is the first layer. And beyond that are even greater layers, you see. So this is now turning into a interdimensional sort of reference. Much like in the Hindu tradition, we can look to Kabbalism and talk about the different sephirot and talk about how these aren't necessarily places materially, but they are realms of being, although this subject matter is quite confusable, to be fair. So then, let's get a comprehensive overview of the biblical cosmology. Although Leviathan is present and is slain in a very substitutive way, this is not a necessary part of the cosmology. What is biblical is that there is a storehouse for the winds, there is a firmament that was put there intentfully that holds out the cosmic ocean, which is on all sides, and there are pillars of the earth, foundations of the earth, and pillars of heaven. But we don't know exactly how many heavens there are. If we're looking purely at the Christian end of this, then there could be as many as 3. And if we include Islam into this conversation, then there is most certainly 7. But otherwise, we're left to wonder what the heavens look like or if there are any degrees of separation. The ambiguity of this subject matter in the given text leads to a number of Christian scholars well throughout the Middle Ages speculating as to what this all looks like exactly. And most of the diagrams that we might have seen in regards to this cosmology were made in that time period, but aren't necessarily biblical. They're biblically inspired, but they're not biblical. The biblical cosmology then is a Western cosmology, since they're almost exactly the same, with very few differences. The differences are meaningless, honestly. with exception that the Bible seems to be much more ambiguous on this subject. It doesn't give as many details as most other relevant creation stories do. You can see how all of this was put together by earnest observation of the exterior world and by an earnest intrigue with trying to understand where we are and what this looks like. And this, in fact, is quite wondrous. This was a very kind of Wild West time, so to speak, in the sense that the imagination was left to run wild in this speculation. And so then the world was much more wondrous in this way until we started to move towards a codified religious system. And this would take away that wonder or would placate that open question that we sincerely couldn't answer, or that we could only answer by the faculties of our thorough and immediate observation. It's interesting to note how this material is still very allegorically resonant. For instance, the astronaut is an astronaut, meaning like a nautilus, like the sea. We still very much conceive of space much more like an ocean than that of simply flying. It is a spaceship after all. And while it's so easy to potentially point to the past and say how silly they were for thinking this way, I feel we should point out a few things in this regard. One, that they knew as much as their faculties allowed them to know. And in the same respect, how we are limited by our faculties to know, and how much could potentially exist in the same way outside of our knowable faculties. How we could be substantially humbled by the knowledge of the future. But also, there is something tragic here that's lost, and that is the wonderment of it all. When we are told exactly what to think about where we are and what this is on about, we lose a substantial curiosity. We lose a sense of wonderment about the world. And this isn't to solicit an anarchy in this regard, but to just sense that of which we had and that of which we lost by these hard, concretized cosmologies. But perhaps the question isn't so completely answered by speaking to material things. Perhaps the question of where we are is something that exceeds well beyond material observation. Inevitably, as a Westerner, in regards to the subject of death, invariably one brings up the idea of heaven. Heaven and hell, to say that this is heavenly, that there is a realm above where people go. This is commonplace. But we don't ask how. How did it become commonplace? In that, why is heaven good? In the history of human thought, in the history of religions and mythology, how can we substantiate the idea that heaven is good? Why was heaven ever a place to go to? What did the heavens represent to the people of this era who are sharing this idea of dying and going to heaven? Many just assume this to be an irrevocable fact. But what if instead we could look into the ways of thinking of the ancients to track this philosophy, this framing of the world, and to better understand what exactly was meant by those initially sharing this material? As opposed to divulging cosmology, we are instead divulging what heaven is ideologically. And maybe from this we could glean what is that heaven that these individuals are claiming that they or others are going to. Let's open ourselves to the philosophy, to the metaphysics, to the abstractions that truly come along with this subject. what is heaven? When it comes to the afterlife, there are a few ways that we traditionally go about, religiously speaking. All would assume some sort of innate soul or innate spirit that has an eternal essence or an eternal continuity. Whether this eternal self moves into reincarnation, moves into an eventual place of dissolve and becoming one with the universe, or in this case, moves into a place that will become eternally its home, these all imply this soul continuity, or a form of our being that is immortal. Let's dial it back all the way to the ancient caves. When we see these pictures, these pictographs of ancient animals, we might assume simply that these ancient peoples were working on their artistic skills, were just kind of mucking about with the rock walls and experimenting. Didn't really mean much at all, other than some sort of play. But instead, if we dug a bit deeper into our anthropology and a bit deeper into our own oral traditions, then we know that these forms on the side of the cave wall were an attempt to solicit this animal. Their picture, their depiction, was a sort of incantation, bringing them forward. Now, there's a few ways to go about understanding this. The cave was the initial Earth Mother womb. This is the conception. In the earliest forms of religion, there was the Earth Mother, or the Mother Goddess. This cave would have been a sort of home of all the essences that would appear in the greater world. This womb births things into the world. The cave as the womb, and the world as the extension out from that womb. To put the picture in the cave would be to incite the manifestation of that animal in the exterior world. This is what we want to pay attention to here. The idea of essence becoming manifested outside of this other dimension, this womb, so to speak. This is not too different than our standard understanding of the law of manifestation. If we say something enough, if we pursue something enough, then we call it forward. This is a don't say bear out in the woods if you don't want a bear to show up sort of thing. We attract that of which we wish to experience. And so in this way, you put the picture of the animal in the cave. Now, this has implications as to the later forms of deification. Where are we sourcing this emotion or this need from? And what I mean by that is if we want more beauty in our lives, if we want more fertility and abundance in the land, we might just make that a character like Aphrodite or Venus, and then we have something to point to, something to bring up, a name to bring up in order to solicit that essence. In the anthropomorphization of that essence, making it a god, giving it a name, we might just get lost in time and confuse the character with the essence, when in fact this was all about that essence, that thing that we wished to distill. In war, in battle, there is a particular emotion that might come over us that makes us nigh invincible. This sort of adrenaline-drowned rage. This essence is observable and becomes of us. And we might just take this essence, give it a name, and give it an anthropomorphization, for purposes of summoning it once it becomes necessary or desirable to do so. So then, these essences that we've observed, whether we're putting a form in a cave or whether we're calling for a certain deity, both are hinting at something that the ancients found universally agreeable. And that is that there's a place for these essences. That these beingnesses that we observe in material ways in this world are somewhere else, invisible, remote, affecting this world, but not necessarily tangible. We have something to do with these things becoming tangible, with these things becoming manifested, corporealized in this world. We play a unique part in bringing these things forward that would otherwise be secluded in this other realm. A marker of ancient culture versus more modern cultures would be that in ancient cultures, we wouldn't go out and get that immediate need that we needed directly. We wouldn't just chop down a tree to make the house, so to speak. There would be a ceremony. There would be an initiation into gathering those materials. The proper respects would be given to the animals that we would use for this process, so forth. These things would be thought of as attracting the essence that is required or desired, not just simply make it happen, you see. It wasn't simply just a matter of making that house, it was a matter of what you're bringing forward, what you're inviting, and what you're perpetuating by this action. What you're choosing to manifest into the world. This is why they were so attentive. In the halls of philosophy, of course, we have to mention Plato, and most iconically, perhaps, of Plato is the world of forms, or the Hyper-Uranian realm. Now, a lot goes into this context-wise before Plato can present this in a way that we might think is a novel way of thinking, when in truth, it's not very original at all given the context of ancient religion, spirituality, and mentality, really. The heavens were historically believed to be the realm of this order, or where these forms delineate from. And there are a few reasons for this. The earth is more chaotic by our perception. When we look upward, we notice that there are patterns to the stars in their movement, to the sun's recursion, and to the moon's shapes. There is an order presented to us via the sky. So then, we also have observed that when the sky is a certain way, then there's a certain season. And when the sky's a different way, then there's a different type of season. And so we project that the sky, or the heavens, is bringing down this change onto the earth. Thus, the effect that the heavens have on what is happening here and now. But the world above is of great mystery to us. We develop astrology in order to understand what it's trying to say, what the gods or divinity or this great plan is trying to say to us. We build and build and build the sophistication, but it's all around this fascination of what the heavens are trying to show us. This plays into the archetypal beginnings of what would become fundamental for religions, and that is the Earth Mother and the Sky Father. The Earth Mother provides all the things that we need more actively and closer to us, and the Sky Father gives the pattern. Pater, pattern, shows the more archetypal or invisible ways that this world is becoming, so to speak. But then we look up to the heavens and we see how these cycles throughout years repeat themselves. And they don't die. They don't fall away. They always return or continuously show themselves in a way that the world doesn't. And so then we think of the heavens as immortal. Now then, we have two established ideas here. A sort of innate essence that comes from somewhere else, and the projection of immortality onto the heavens. So then, we return to Plato, this Hyper-Uranian realm, or this Platonic realm of forms, is an interesting merging of these ideas. It is to say, simply, that physical things decay. What is on this earth decays, but somewhere else there is its perfect form. And these physical forms that appear on the earth are all imitations or deviations, derivations from what is otherwise a perfect essence, a perfect design. This certainly plays pretty well with the ancient idea of destiny, or the heavens prescribing what will happen on the earth, and thus the omens and more prophetic end of astrology. The ancient idea of fate, and how interwoven it was in the culture of the ancients. Again, this design that brings itself down to what is becoming increasingly understood as a faulty world, or a world that can mess up this divine plan, you see. And the heavens are particularly wily in their composition in this day and age. This is more of a conversation for cosmology, but what are the heavens? What is the firmament? All these speculations as to where we are and what this all actually looks like. And that's why the word is Hyper-Uranian. Uranos is the heavens, and hyper is above that. So that which is beyond all of these variable layers of heaven. So if we were to modernize this, then it would be outside of all of physical existence, and outside of all of which that has substantiated in the material world. There is another realm of being that is actually more real than this one in a very distinctive way. And this is why Plato's cave is so evocative when it comes to this subject. We began with conversations of the cave, and that's why this is particularly paradoxical and apropos. In this instance, though, Plato's cave is, of course, a falsity, showing the shadows on the cave wall, believing this to be real. And we're led to believe that material existence, that of which we're dealing with here, is the Maya, as the Hindu tradition would put it, is illusion. And what is true is what's outside of that cave. So this isn't a subversion, you see. What's outside of that cave is what's outside of the material world, the heavens. But what's outside of our material world? What's outside of this cave? Or as the ancients often put it, being sealed in by a lid. That the world is sealed in, a kind of prison, as it was put many times over. What's outside of that? Well, that's the Hyper-Uranian. That is the realm of forms. You can see how we're really starting to divulge the actual philosophy here and all the implications that come along with it. We, in our plan, in our essence, would be immutable, would be without blemish and without mortality, if only that we could truly become that of our design, or that of the plan, or that of the emanation, the initial emanation. Abstract things or ideas cannot be broken. Ideas live through us. We embody ideas. We bring them forward. We manifest them on the earth. The variant countries of the world started as ideas, and these ideas gained substantiation through human efforts. And now we would call them, quote, real. So then, this is a question of what are ideas? Where do they come from? Where can they exist? What is their essence? What is their nature? Can we become more like that? Can we deny what we don't wish to experience of this world and instead move towards that sort of beingness instead, a more abstract form of beingness as opposed to a more carnal form of beingness or a more embodied form of beingness? And you can see why this became a sort of hatred for all that was physical. Why one would deny themselves the pleasures of the body or procreation, these nasty material things that would be called the devil, and instead only wish to pursue that which is intangible, that which is abstract, and that which is perceivably immortal as opposed to mortal and temporal. Right away in the beginnings of Christianity, there's substantial attention paid to the, quote, apotheosis. This apotheosis is theo, which is God or divinity, or to become that of divinity, or to become deified. Now, what is the nitty-gritty here? How does one become deified or achieve apotheosis? And this is ascendancy to an idea. Like the divine itself, it is immortal because of its likeness to abstraction. In the pagan traditions, when one would achieve a great feat, like Perseus or Hercules, they would go through a katasterismos, or an ascendancy into constellation. So this individual in their deeds would be remembered, would become an idea, and thus they would be given a constellation in the heavens because that's where ideas always were thought to exist. So they have ascended into an idea, and they are projected into the heavens accordingly. And these saints that achieve the ascendancy, where do they go towards? Where do they ascend to? They ascend to the heavens, towards their own sainthood or immortality, their deification. As deities are ideas, so they will become. So you can see how Plato isn't introducing something novel or strange. Plato is simply distilling that which is inherently a religious and spiritual idea or projection onto the universe that has been forming for the history of humankind. This realm of forms, or this realm of light, as it often gets called, is caught up in a number of different religions, much more directly speaking. In Mandean cosmology, the heavens resemble this world of forms much more readily. In Gnostic cosmology, the pleroma is much more evocative of this archetypal realm of ideas than it is that of a sort of place in the clouds where a bunch of people in their regular bodies are prancing about in a manner that really isn't very different than Earth at all. What this dissolve of the afterlife actually looks like in this effect is simply a matter of who you're talking to and at what point of history we're talking about this idea of heaven. In many Brahmanic or Hindu conceptions, this achieving of moksha is a return to the ocean. If we are a droplet, then we return to the ocean. We become a part of something much bigger than ourselves. But this gives our identity away. This destroys our distinction as individuals, and we instead become a part of something much greater. And this is the whole, meaning it's holy. It's the whole thing, or the all loneliness, all despair, all mortality, all falling short of what we might wish for ourselves and others would be destroyed along with our identity as we join and become subsumed by that ocean, so to speak. So the abstraction or the question of what this heaven is actually like is notable. What are its implications philosophically? Now, there are other ways to tend to this too, and I also want to point out how universal this is. In ancient native cosmologies and cosmogonies, there is most often the case where the animals aren't invented on this world. The human isn't invented here. They are allowed to manifest here. They are called forward to exist on this world when the world is ready for it. And so by that, it implies, yet again, that there is another state of being outside of this world, literally this world, that we exist in. But in that other realm, we desired to come to this one, to become embodied. That's the different implication, that there is something to be desired there in this tactile experience that we wished for. And that otherwise there seems to be this case of a kind of purgatory or a plasticity that we would will to change if we could. So this isn't to say that it's necessarily a hell or a beatific heaven, but it would be to say that it's more of a stasis. And that the world is actually a great gift. And that we should do well with it. We should do good by it. And this is a very different approach to this very same subject matter. You see how caught up in our heads we can be, and how this isn't simply just a matter of philosophy or achieving the greatest summation of ideas to ever manifest in the history of humankind, yada, yada, yada. But it's more about how we think of ourselves and what we think of the world. And the assumptions that we inherit from tradition and culture will inform us how we treat that. If we inherited this instead, then this world isn't something to escape. This world is something we sought, we waited for. And this is most often the case in Aboriginal stories. We waited for this. And this is not the first world. Worlds come and go, and we will continue on to the next because of the immortality of our design. And this reincarnation is not something to will to escape, to become utterly destroyed as a desire, but instead that we help its becoming, that we bring that plan forward, you see, in its earnest fashion, that we do everything in our power to bring about that design and to honor it. So let's think about this in a few different ways. Let's tease out some of this novel nature of this great history, this great thought that we've pampered and curated over time. If we project that heaven in the way that it's been preached is a thing, then by this historical way of thinking, our experience of that afterlife would be the greatest version of ourself, completely unmarred by the downfalls of this world. If you can imagine being given all of the things that you needed to become the best version of yourself, that would be the kind of wish fulfillment of this realm of ideas, the greatest way that it works out. Almost like it's in your head. If you are planning a certain future, then you think of all the ways that things are going to go right for your most direct way of receiving this thing that you want, right? In your head, there are no obstacles and there's no uncertainty. This is resemblant of that realm, that hyper-Uranian, that heaven, that place beyond the heavens. And again, we should emphasize, certainly not the clouds. It would be beyond the cusp of material things. But if instead we think of this in a different way, that the heaven is more resemblant of that Platonic forms realm, then we are simply an idea. We are completely abstract. There is no actual experience of anything, because in order to experience anything, you need a body. You need tactility. You need uncertainty. You need vibration, ups, downs, smiles and frowns, all of the dualities and spectrums that come along with sensual existence. That's what it takes to experience something. But instead, this realm of ideas would be completely alien to our beingness. And any sort of experience of it would be completely alien to what we think living is. And then there's the more indigenous perspective on this, the more historically sourced perspective on this. And that is that this is a sort of ancillary state of being, an exterior state of being that isn't as active, that isn't as dynamic, let's just say, and is idyllic in the sense that it seems to be without troubles, but also without animacy. And so then there comes a great desire for realms of play, so to speak, for these sandboxes for the imagination that we call the world. And that these worlds don't come about with any shortage of effort. They are indeed quite rare. And so accordingly, our presence and beingness on them when they arise is beautiful beyond measure. And in that then, the only other realm, so to speak, whether it's said directly, more subliminally or implicitly, is not really much of a heaven, but does assure continuity. Greater speaking yet, comes the projective implication of all of this. And that is to say, we can flip this and say that we are the projection of that reality happening in this other realm of being, that hyper-Uranian. And this is the biggest headspan, where this realm of being is just a place of shadows. It's just a bunch of derivations. Nothing's sincere, nothing's full. Nothing is ever a genuine full avatar of a virtue or an idea. Everything is a delineation, far from its source. And so then, that other place is where the projections are, where it's projecting out from. And so this muffled existence would be shallow in comparison to the full-fledgedness of the other realm of being that is trying to work its way through to this realm of being, you see, or is imitated by this realm of being. And so then to return to that would be returning to a sense, an experience that is more bountiful, more fruitful, more experientiable than anything that this realm could ever offer. Some of you may have had a dream that has felt more real than reality has ever felt. This is a rare experience, but this would be the pitch. That other realm, that other state of being, would offer this beyond sensation phenomena continuously. All of these different ways of interpreting heaven on a historical basis, of discussing this subject on a historical basis, none of this implies exclusivity. Unless we introduce the idea of what you attract once more. What you attract would be what you want. And if what you want is more along the lines of this realm, you want the carnal things, you want the material beauties, then that's what you'll get. And they call this hell. as opposed to the many beautiful things that this realm genuinely offers and physical forms genuinely offer. It's to say that your desire of those material things is what would lead you to another realm of being. So that's a different creation, and that's a whole different story. Hell, in this way. And if instead you desired those abstract things, then that law of attraction would bring you upward toward those things. Both of these potential futures have a lot of fundamental assumptions. For instance, that your will and your attraction are dictations of this, and that these two different realms exist in exactly the way that they are purported to exist. So this possibility also introduces the idea of choice into this. Instead of all of us being mutually created under the same circumstances, now we can introduce another variable into this equation, which would be some sort of importance in regards to the nature of choice. If the upper realms or the heavens are giving a dictation of what ought to be, and people are not going with what ought to be, then they deserve by choice something other than fate. This then would imply that heaven is a default for those that would be going along with their fates. But this is easier said than done, because how do you know? What does that look like? Is it only illustrative of what orthodox institutions would tell us it looks like? You can see how messy these grounds truly are, if we're actually interested in looking into what these grounds actually are. This is all to say that there is actually an earnest basis for how heaven was invented and the form that it's taken on in our modern day. And so when we passively nod to heaven or heavenly things, this is a nod to a great summation of thought, a becoming of an idea that has matured and taken variant forms across time. But each of these changes are, to a certain degree, fickle. They are based in metaphysical assumptions. They are based in cultural attitudes. So then, its exact form of how it looks or how people talk about it is picky, particular. A certain creed, let's just put it that way. It could be that heaven is this realm of plasticity of our designs. It could be that heaven is completely and utterly abstract. And it could be that our beginning assumption underneath all of this of the continuity and immortality of the soul is not exactly the way that we imagined it to be. All of these are fundamental assumptions that lead to a very particular way of interpreting all of this philosophical history. So then, the question of what heaven is does have basis. But in investigating that basis in a historical way, you find that there are far more leads than you might have assumed. And that the mystery of the heavens is in fact much greater than we could have initially anticipated. Even for those that earnestly follow these doctrines, the heavens simply cannot be that of which they have depicted, clouds and people prancing about. That is good for artistic rendition, but is certainly not the abstract reality of what it's implying. Its historical basis is much more abstract than that. You can see why Christianity has this paradoxical relationship with the divine plan and with the idea of choice. Because the divine plan would be that emanation from the astrological heavens downward. And the choice would be what we would will to attract. This fundamental basis for the world, then you throw in through Jesus Christ. And all of that works together to substantiate the socio-normative interpretation of the Christian cosmology and afterlife. But heaven wasn't something that was shown through ecstatic vision to the choice few, and thus it appears in scriptures. Heaven as an idea, as a realm of being was an abstraction grown by the mind throughout time, from the very beginning of days. From the caves onward, this idea of essence as being separate from manifestation and beingness. This realm of essences, or that of which we are at our core, despite the delusions of the world. So then, more poignantly, more effectively, we should ask ourselves, who are we at that core? What is our essence? What is our design then? What are we actually behind the projection of being? It's very substantial to contemplate and to introspect on this. And if that other person, that ideal form of ourself, or that one that's shut off by this world is there, where do they exist? Where do they come from? Where could they be what they want to be?
The universe could be described as the surface of a four-dimensional sphere.